Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, the view from the top is not always the best. Consider this. You are the Tar Heel State's chief economic developer / recruiter during an unprecedented time of economic and political uncertainty, to say the least. What's not to like? Welcome to this special edition of the most widely watched program on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and joining us again in just a moment, North Carolina Secretary of Commerce, Keith Crisco.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded April 25th, 2012. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Keith Crisco, Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Commerce. Now, Chris William.
Welcome to our program. Happy spring. Your Honor, welcome back. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I want to ask you this question because I know on the way to the studio you got stuck in traffic, and I want to say, does this warrant a call to Gene Conte or Tom Bradshaw about, maybe we need to put on the fast track what goes on in the Charlotte region when it comes around transportation?
Some people in Charlotte tell me we're on the fast track, that what we've done with, at least we're the 485 we're doing it, and 85 is expanding, and there's a bridge up around Salisbury is being worked on, and I guess that's a price we have to pay for progress. So.
I wasn't, Mr. Secretary, I wasn't going to start with this, but let's talk about this a little bit. Transportation in infrastructure. I know you know more than probably most people how critical that is to not just, a year or 5 years, but 10 and 20 years out. How do you make the case? And South Carolina has the same issue with I-26, and the Ports Authority are trying to deepen the harbor and widen I-26 that way down there. How do we battle, not battle, but how do you make the case against those that make a good case around education? And how do you say, yeah, education is important. It certainly is. But so is transportation infrastructure. I mean, how do you argue that case?
Well, allocating scarce resources called cash and funds is part of public policy and part of any government. That's where the real issues come forth. But, and I'm one that's pushing education as much as anybody. But at the same time, we've got to do both. And clearly transportation issues, what I like to call logistic issues, are long-term. And if we look throughout the world economy, we've got to be competitive. We've got to understand globalization. And by doing that, logistics, infrastructure is fundamental. The answer is we've got to do both. And there's our challenge in times of scarce. But maybe long-term financing, maybe long-term approaches, but the key word is long-term. We've got to look at a long-term educational policy, how it fits into the economy of the future. We've got to look at logistics, how that fits. It's a form of being competitive. Our competition is improving their infrastructure. Asia, now Central America, now South America is spending big bucks in improving their infrastructure. That's the comparison. That's our competition. We really have no choice but to do both somehow.
I sit here as you speak and think about that. We've had you on this program before, and we had you on the program not long after you got the job in January of 2009. And,
right.
You arguably took the job thank you for doing it. You took the job at one of the toughest times in the Tar Heel states, not just economic cycle, secular economic cycle, Mr. Secretary, but also political uncertainty. The Republicans hadn't been in control. And now here we are, North Carolina is a battleground state, and there's more political uncertainty around getting public policy done. So I guess as you look at the economy, as you look at the public policy and the political landscape, where do you see us going in 5 years or 10 years, given what you know right now?
Well, first of all, I took the job because I love North Carolina. I didn't take it because of the issues. And if it was a challenge, that made it even more interesting. And I think we have made progress. We're transitioning our economy at the same time we're battling a recession. So those two issues sometimes get confused. And so let me talk about both of those. I think the general economy has made progress. We see an uptick. We see more jobs created every month, and numbers which admittedly are not bouncing like we would like to see them, but there's reasons for that. We've talked in the past about the impact of automation, the impact of being more competitive. There's many examples of plants that we've created which have wonderful outputs in our world and are sustainable and competitive. That's the good news. The bad news is through automation, again, they don't require as many jobs to have the same output. So we're seeing that issue affect the number of people going back to work. But we do see an overall increase in output and overall a little bit more consumer confidence has created, again, a better atmosphere for business. Mm-hmm. And so we see that in many areas. Some are still lagging. Housing, for example, it still doesn't have a real spark. So the general economy, we think, is doing better in North Carolina, somewhat better in the nation. Still a long way to go. We're in a big hole. It's going to take a long time to get out of it. So that's one issue. On top of that, as we look down the road for 5 years, we need to continue our transformation from more basic manufacturing, for example, to what I call advanced manufacturing that can, again, be competitive worldwide. Mm-hmm. Some of the industries we're bringing are more diverse today than they were when I was in manufacturing. And our markets are quite different. Our exports are booming, are really growing in exports. We're finally, I think, realizing in North Carolina that some of these other countries are not competitors, they're customers. And that attitude that's the quickest way to increase jobs is export. So we're doing more of that. And we're both have an uptick in the general economy and our consumer confidence. Plus, we're transforming the mix of our economy. And we need to continue to do that. And since we have made progress, we're viewed nationwide as one of the top 5 states ready to recover. And they look at what we've done. Our export business at Commerce, our organization, has been acclaimed as a leader. So we're in a position to move forward. It'll be slower than I want, slower than you want. But if you just look back the numbers a year or two ago where we are today, most people will conclude that we are on a good track.
In a politically expedient world, when we do want the recovery to bounce back, and certainly bounce back a lot quicker than the last 4 years, how frustrating is it when we all talk about jobs and we all want to know, what's the rate of jobs added last month? Where are we with jobs? How do we compete with our neighbors?
Right.
How do you get past? Again, Mr. Secretary, how do you sell this idea that, folks, it is about jobs, but it's not just about jobs, and you need to understand X. What is the X factor?
It's about sustainable jobs. We had a lot of jobs in North Carolina that were vulnerable to world competition. We need to create more jobs that are competitive worldwide.
And did we want to let those jobs go anyway?
We did. Well, I won't say anyone really wanted to have the short-term shock of those jobs leaving. Okay. In fact, one miscalculation we made is the rate of globalization, the rate of change of some of our traditional industries. I mean, we literally turned our back and they were gone. No one can support that because the short-term impact of good people working hard was very severe in our state. But in the long run, if we can for a minute think long run, to transition into more sustainable jobs that are somewhat insulated to the impact of worldwide is a good thing, and it should be part of our public policy to focus on those jobs. And so if I could retrace the last 10 or 15 years, we would have done some things to not let it move so fast away from those traditional jobs, but But again, in the long run, I don't think we should build an economy based on those jobs because they're just not sustainable.
And it leads to a couple other things. In our own neighborhood, North and South Carolina are very familiar and familial. Last year in 2011, Continental Tire, in a very highly touted move from North Carolina to South Carolina. And some of the political fallout around that was, let's face it, was not North Carolina's best day. There was some sniping going on. You have made comments that you really would like to see more of neighboring communities like North and South Carolina work closer together. What does that mean? How does that happen?
Well, we've done some of that, and we need to do more of that.
So Bobby hit and you talk about how to...
Yes, and let me give you an example. While we get really hung up, so to speak, between North and South Carolina and our border and competing for one particular project, in the very big picture in the world, it's the Southeast. In the Southern Governors Association program that I really pushed, we're doing some marketing, have done some marketing of the American South. In Asia, for example, they think of San Francisco, they think of New York, they think of Chicago. If we can focus them on the American South and our great manufacturing heritage and the productivity of our people, and we've done some of that, all of a sudden we're all ahead. Yes, when they come here, we may compete of whether they're in Alabama or they're in North Carolina or South Carolina. But unless we get them to look here for investment, and by the way, 25% of our investment in North Carolina last year of new investment, new companies coming to our state was foreign direct investment. So that's a real critical part. And rather,
who is the largest investor of that 25%?
Last year, I believe that was actually from Canada, a company called Linamar out of Asheville. That was the largest single investor. And Canada counts too for foreign investment. And we do more of that, marketing our area. In the long run, we're all going to be better off. So we got to keep that in mind. So we do that. So that's one way of doing it. Now there are individual changes and changes in political leadership between many states in the Southeast. I think we had 7 new governors in November, and that's a significant change in leadership, last November, in leadership, and there's always some different perspectives.
And staying on that same thing, Secretary Crisco, when you talk about working with South Carolina more closer, is that are there finite results there, or are we missing an opportunity by not? We'll use Secretary Bobby hitting South Carolina more. Is there much more dialogue that you two could be having in your mind?
I think we could be doing more. Yeah, sure. We all get busy, and I don't do as much as I should, but that's a clear objective to do that. We're getting together in about a month. There's a conference in Myrtle Beach between Canada and the Southeast, and Bobby will be hosting it, and I'll be there. We'll be together, and I hope we can do more and more. Every job's precious, and I know that, and therefore the short-run temptation to be aggressive is very big and very important, and competition is a good thing. And since every job's very, very precious, I know there'll be individual competition, and that's okay, and that's part of the deal. But laid on top of that should be an overall understanding. If we promote this area, North and South Carolina, both are hot for companies to look at, and we need to leverage all that.
Not long ago, we had Steve Kerrigan, who's the CEO of the Democratic National Committee, clearly focused on Charlotte, but it will be an interesting dialogue for the balance of 2012. And we were talking about public discourse, and this goes back to the question and the issue that you and I talked about when something happens and the less attractive dialogue happens, and there's not respect, and the public discourse is uncomfortable for many people. Mr. Secretary, again, how do we change some of this?
Well, you probably change it the way my country music hero Johnny Cash did. One piece at a time, one deal at a time, one conversation at a time. And I've really taken it as my mission. I lived the last 30 years of my life in a place in North Carolina which was very much, the political landscape was very much the party I was not in. And my company flourished. I've flourished with many friends. I've used that approach in Raleigh. And I spend equal time with both sides, and we talk about issues. While you're right, there was one example, and it was Continental Tire, was not our best day. We didn't agree. We were a little sniping going on. No one likes to lose, and I think that was part of it. Mm-hmm. Once we saw we were not getting it, there were some issues there we talked about. But there's been 4 or 5 major projects since then. It could not have been better cooperation. We just had one that we won. Frankly, we had one that we lost. Another one we lost, not to South Carolina, but another state. It's unfortunate we lost because it was a textbook of cooperation. Everybody pulled together. We had the Senate and the House and the governor saying the same thing. We put our best foot forward, and yes, we lost. But you're going to lose some, you're going to win some. But we played that one very well, and there's several others. Colonel was not that one. Maybe you almost have to go through that trauma to really mess up to realize we shouldn't be playing the game that way. And we have not played it since then. So there's a silver lining there. Frankly, I'd rather had those jobs than to learn something from a mistake. But if we do mess up, let's learn from it, and I believe we have.
Speaking of jobs, South Carolina has been extremely fortunate and blessed to have BMW as being, as you well know. And now it seems like they've got the cusp of another BMW type, and that is Boeing, as you well know. Recently, they've rolled out their 787, the first 787 produced in South Carolina. When you look at what Boeing has represented for the Low Country, what do you think? What goes through your head?
Well, first, a great success, and I congratulate them on that. That was an unusual one when most of the decisions were in place before my time as Secretary of Commerce. I will point out that we in North Carolina are benefiting from that. With a lot of suppliers are based in North Carolina.
So there's a halo effect.
Absolutely, are supplying to people in the Boeing plant. In addition, we have a thriving aerospace business right here in North Carolina. We're making parts for the Airbus here in Kinston, North Carolina right now. And so Spirit is in North Carolina. Now Spirit is a supplier of the Airbuses and the Boeings. They supply a lot in Boeing. They're not making those in North Carolina right now. So we have a thriving, and that is a perfect example of what I was talking about. Collectively, Boeing is a point, but also the aerospace movement to the southeast, of which South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina will participate in, are participating, and Alabama and Tennessee, is what it's about. And if we do more cooperation and not get too upset, now I'd love to have every one of those jobs in North Carolina, but at the same time, I know that's not going to happen. But if we can together build a quality aerospace industry throughout this region, we're all going to come out ahead.
One of the related, you talk about the aerospace cluster, one of the related things in North Carolina for many years has been the military infrastructure that both the Carolinas have had. And obviously, with much public policy talk about cutting more military spending, how on the radar, no pun intended, is some of the military cuts to economic development? How much do you think that, how much is that showing up in your head as you plan?
As my rough estimate is I spend 15 to 20% of my time on military issues, on everything from going to Washington to talking to people about these decisions to being on the ground. I think I've been to Cherry Point 10 times in 3 years, and to brag many, many times. We've developed advisory councils, we've developed cooperative buying groups, we've focused on everything from military textiles to military hardware. We've got a new joint agreement between NASCAR and Special Forces, and that's some of the technology. What NASCAR knows a lot about people walking away from a 200-mile crash healthy. The Special Forces were envious of some of that, and that was a connection. So there's all kind of, there's so many ways we're promoting, connecting, and trying to recruit. So we're very much into that. The cuts, by being aggressive, we believe we will minimize the impact in North Carolina. In fact, there are really going to be some winners and losers, and we're trying to be winners, and I think we will be.
When you do the modeling for base realignment or cuts, let's just call them cuts.
Yeah.
When you do the modeling within commerce, I mean, how bad does it look in your opinion?
I don't think it looks too bad. In fact, of course, a lot of these decisions are political oriented there, and to be made, really the impact's going to be several years down the way. But again, I think we've got a chance of actually doing some gains in some. It's a very important part of our economy. It's very important to Eastern North Carolina, particularly. It's everywhere, but particularly Eastern North Carolina.
You know, and let's stay with that for just a second. Eastern North Carolina, at least the political will around, switch here just a little bit, political will around fracking, around the possible development of, of gas exploration within the Tar Heel State, maybe offshore, that seems to be changing a little bit. How would you like to see that develop?
Well, the political will is changing a little bit, but I think the first thing is keep in perspective our resources versus some other states. While we have the opportunity to be a player, our footprint of our resources is quite a bit smaller than many other states. That doesn't mean not do it. Just keep in perspective that we're not going to be dominant in this business. But there are areas of our state that can benefit from hard regulation. I call it the gold standard of regulation. Do it well, do it with eyes wide open. I think we must proceed in some cautious way to be in this business.
Do you think, and a certain, we'll go nameless, a certain CEO of an energy company said he agreed with that, but yet he felt like there was a first mover advantage. I'm not pressing you on this, but is there, how do you balance being first mover? Is it important to be a first mover when it comes to development of this energy resource, or being safe in doing it?
Well, I don't think I saw that quote, but in gas exploration, natural gas, we're not first mover. I mean, Pennsylvania and other states, for example,
I mean in the Southeast. I mean among our...
Well, within the Southeast, we don't have the reserves of Kentucky, of Tennessee, but we do have significant reserves. And so by being the first, perhaps by being the first move would be an advantage. But I don't think we need to consider that. I think we be very careful about regulations. My bias is to do it. My bias is to do it very carefully with, again, the gold standard of regulations. I've talked to gas companies who want to do it, and their biggest concern is that without proper regulations, someone will come in and do a bad job, hurt our environment, and that'll be a bad taste in everybody's mouth, and we won't do anything. But if we do it correctly or best of our judgment in a small scale initially, we'll in the long run be able to gain the benefits of this natural resource.
My apologies for interrupting you on that one. In assuming knowing that there will be a change in the governor's mansion in North Carolina, you would still hold that line, whoever the next governor
would.
Be. We've got a couple minutes left, and I think it would be important to get this out. Here you are in the job for almost 3.5 years now, and whether you stay, whether you go, how would you, if you could reboot the whole system, if you could change the DNA of not just the way commerce works, Mr. Secretary, but how the competitive landscape around economic development works, what one thing would you do?
Well, if I had a Crisco magic wand, I think that's the question, I would put a long-term perspective in everybody's head about what we've got to do to get our infrastructure and our educational base. And I'd spend a lot of money in matching. I would try to match our workforce with the industries that are coming down the pike. My concern is that we need to be efficient in educational planning. The technologies, the talents. In fact, there are pockets of North Carolina where we have high unemployment and we have jobs that cannot be filled. And somehow we've got to do a good job or a better job of matching what we train people to do.
Let me ask you something about matching, though, and literally we've got less than a minute left. Matching, whose job is matching? Is that commerce? Is that the community college system?
It's a great question. It's neither. It's commerce and community colleges and other identities working together. Last week, we brought the head of community college, head of commerce, and governor's office together for a day to talk about that point. How can we together combine our systems to do a better job?
Mr. Secretary, we so appreciate you coming on here. We didn't talk about JDIG. We didn't talk about North Carolina.
I'll come back.
We didn't, please. We didn't talk about the European opera and how that affects our trade. And I know you know a little bit about international trade, but We will absolutely have you back. And thank you. I don't think it's playing into too much here, but thank you for doing a wonderful job in a very difficult time.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again. Thank you for watching our program. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, who's responsible for rising healthcare costs. Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.